Hey, been a while since we had one of these. You may remember over the past year I made 3 videos detailing the evolution of the Touhou games throughout different eras and how the next one has been long due. Well, I'm sorry to say that project has been abandoned. Part of it is me simply losing interest in continuing it, another factor is that it kinda deviated from my original goal, instead turning into like mini reviews of each game. And finally, quite frankly, there's not really much to talk about past the modern era. Touhou games haven't really undergone another massive change, the likes of the jump from Imperishable Night and POFB to Maran of Faith. That's not to say there aren't things to talk about, but I think it's better to view them in more broad terms, rather than scanning each game individually to see what pieces they contributed. And that's where this video comes in, which you can kinda treat it as an epilogue to the previous ones. Touhou is a series that has undergone a lot of change throughout the years, starting as a silly, kinda subversive shooter game series in that it ditches the sci-fi setting the genre usually favors for aspects of fantasy inspired by folklore and legends, and eventually turning into a multimedia monster that details a very complex world through its many works, with information hidden around every corner, even in places you wouldn't expect it to be, which nowadays can make it a bit of a frustrating endeavor to try and get all of it, and it's not only because there's just so much to go through. The way lore is communicated in Touhou is both a blessing and a curse, in that it provides details of the world and characters at a very natural pace as you go through the works, but since things are so spread out, it means you might be missing a vital piece of information for years if you skipped a route in one of the games, or didn't bother to read the character's profile because they're only available in English on the Touhou wiki and we're not opening that can of worms right now. Please read the character profiles. Anyways, that's just how massive Touhou has become, and as with plenty of media that has been going on for a long time, this discussion has also come up here. Are the older titles better than the newer ones? No, nor the other way around, mind you. I had some affinity for certain aspects of classic Touhou, which I'll get into later, and that's the thing, it's really a matter of preference. I believe each part of Touhou's history has its own specific goals and different aspects they wanna focus on, and you might like some more than others. But that's exactly what I wanna talk about in this video. It took a while for Sun to settle on what he really wanted for his series, and so we get different periods that are all consistently Touhou, yet still have their clear differences. So I want to take a more concise look at how Touhou's philosophy and themes have changed throughout the years, what elements were dropped in favor of others, and what those changes meant for the series as a whole, at least according to my own interpretations of the works, and what we know of Sun's thought process behind his decisions. So, PC98. PC98 Touhou is kinda interesting to look back upon. It's very different from modern Touhou both gameplay and lore-wise, but because it's so different, it can be difficult to relate it back to what the series is nowadays. During this time, Sun seemingly was only focused on practicing his game-making skills and just simply having fun with it. I think that's why this often contained a lot of references to other media, even at times straight up lifting characters from other works. Some have argued Touhou was also partially inspired by Taito's game Kiki Kaikai, known here as Pocky and Rocky, since they both feature a shrine maiden fighting against creatures lifted from Japanese mythos. It hasn't been explicitly confirmed, though Sun does mention having played the game a lot during his younger years. Then of course we have the music, which really was the catalyst that spawned the Touhou games. We know music to be another big passion of Sun, maybe even more than video games. This is not only because he said so himself, in fact he mentions being part of a brass band club back in middle school where he played the trumpet. Explains a lot, honestly. But it's also evident just by looking at the games, the way pretty much all of them have had a music room or sound test of sorts, which was not uncommon for video games at the time, hell even nowadays you see them fairly often, but Sun I feel has always been pretty set on making sure this is a feature in all of his games, even offering some commentary for each of his songs, which are always nice to read. Mystic Square's music room is probably the best example of this, containing not only the soundtrack of that game, but also rearranged versions of Sun's songs from all his previous games, including some unused ones. So it's safe to say that he was really proud of his music and wanted to share it around as much as possible. These soundtracks were even later released as albums called Aki's Untouched Score, which are technically canon, like the existing universe, kinda. There's that anecdote I mentioned in the Dolls in Pseudo Paradise video, I believe. We'll talk a bit more about that later actually, but it's where Sun got rejected as a music circle at Comiket, which allegedly directly led to the creation of Embodiment of Scarlet Devil, no doubt his most famous game. Crazy how that works, huh? You have to imagine what would have happened if he just ended up signing for music right then and there. In any case, music has always been a big part of Sun's life and of Touhou as well. It's something that has even expanded outside the official works and into fan territory, as seen by the fact that nowadays we have hundreds hundreds upon hundreds of dodging circles, producing thousands of arrangements for pretty much every piece of Touhou music Sun has created. If one of his objectives was to create music that resonated with people, then I'd say he definitely hit the mark on that one and more, producing some of the most memorable and recognizable video game soundtracks out there. Back to the PC-98 games, yeah, there's really not much to say about the writing here. Again, what is there is very scarce and it doesn't really take itself too seriously, being more comedic in nature than anything. That said, we can see the building blocks for what Touhou's setting would eventually become. There is obviously this whole fantasy world filled with magical creatures with various powers, some based off Japanese mythology, particularly yokai, a term used as far back as the first game, highly responsive to prayers actually. Then there's of course Reimu, a Shinto shrine maiden tasked with keeping said creatures at bay. Gensoku was not established as a setting until the Windows games, however it was the Japanese name for the fourth game, Lotus Land Story, and later Sun would actually confirm the PC-98 world is Gensoku as well. The human village didn't officially become like an actual place until the 8th game, Imperishable Night, however again, a location by that name was mentioned in highly responsive to prayers. There's probably a couple others I'm forgetting, but you get the idea. It's hard to say if Sun retroactively looked at these concepts and used them to craft a new, similar, but fundamentally different world later on, or if it was just a natural evolution of things. But what's certain is that the pieces were there. The parts that would eventually become modern Touhou were always there plain to see. However, that would only start taking shape once we enter the Windows era games proper. But before that, there's two works I wanna quickly talk about: Embodiment of Scarlet Devil and Dolls in Pseudo Paradise. These two were released at the same time and they have wildly different tones. Let's start with the OST. Wait, isn't that a Windows game, you might be asking? Well, yes, Embodiment of Scarlet Devil is the 6th Touhou game and the first to be released for Windows systems. Its most notable features are the introduction of the spell card system, which would not only become an iconic mechanic of the series, but also an actual concept in lore. The pretty much complete reboot of the series, introducing us to a new canon that ignores most of the events from PC-98, and the interesting blend between Western and Eastern aesthetics, seen in the setting, characters, and even the music, which I think is one of the reasons this game really hit it off with a lot of people. Despite being the first Windows game, I've seen some people actually consider this to be the last PC-98 game in essence, and I have to agree. There's once again not a lot of seriousness to the writing, most of it being comedic and referential, and although this is the first proper introduction to the world of Gensokyo, not much is said about it and just serves as a backdrop to give some context to the events of the game. That's not me saying EOST is completely irrelevant in the Windows canon, but to me it seems like it happened retroactively rather than something that was planned since the beginning. Later on we would get more info on the events of the game and the characters involved, who would also be featured in other stories as well, but again, at the time of EOST's release, this was not really the case. Then we have Dolls in Pseudo Paradise, the first music CD released by Sun, most of it being rearrangements of songs he made in the past. The point of interest, however, is in the story it contains, a mystery highly inspired by the novel And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, which Sun seems to be a fan of. It's very dark in tone compared to anything we've seen in Touhou up to this point, which initially made it hard for me to believe this was part of the series, even though Gensokyo is mentioned to be the paradise where these events take place. I thought that either this was something new or Sun was trying to take Touhou in a completely different direction. Looking back at it now, to me it seems like this and Embodiment of Scarlet Devil showcase two different faces to the world of Gensokyo, two sides of the same coin so to speak, two aspects that would be carefully balanced in later works, forming the dichotomy that's ever present in Touhou even up to this day. We can assume this album was made at least at the same time as Embodiment of Scarlet Devil, though it's hard to say which one came first. There is a comment about Sun initially wanting to make music that leads to believe Dolls in Pseudo Paradise was finished before OST, but the album also contains music that appears in that game. Are these supposed to be the originals, or are they arrangements? Who knows for sure, it's probably not that important anyways. Hi, bit of a correction here. Dolls in Pseudo Paradise has two tracks that appear in OST, Shanghai Alice on Meiji 17 and You and Owen Was Her. The former is labeled as an original track for the album, and Sun has confirmed the OST version was composed later. You and Owen Was Her does seem to originate from the game, however. What does this mean for the timeline? Not much. Most likely they were both made in tandem, but my guess is that the album began production at least a little bit earlier. Anyways, back to the video. Dolls in Pseudo Paradise was later re-released, except instead of the story, each song receives a little standalone paragraph. It's hard to say what these mean exactly. Some can be related back to the original story of the album, some showcase ideas that will later be introduced proper into the Touhou games, like the mention of Princess Kaguya, who eventually became a character in Imperishable Night, and some just kinda do their own thing. My main takeaway honestly is actually the very first line right after Sun's greeting, which I think perfectly sets up the future of Touhou from this point onwards. That was the new relationship between humans and yokai. Perfect Cherry Blossom, I'd say, is where the world building really takes off and Touhou starts getting more fleshed out. For me, this is the first game that actually has a story to tell, both from the dialogue in-game and the lengthy profiles written for some of its more relevant characters. The comedic aspect is still there, that's always gonna be a part of Touhou in some way. In fact, the actual problem at hand is not taken very seriously by our protagonists, but behind the scenes, there's a level of depth and seriousness that was previously unseen in the games themselves. Again, this is what I meant by Dolls in Pseudo Paradise and Embodiment of Scarlet Devil showing two sides to the world of Touhou. On the surface, once again, you have this fantastical land with magical creatures that cause, ultimately, pretty mundane problems. But it's when you start digging a bit deeper that you discover what this world really is, that there's actually things being said here. There is people living in Gensokyo. The most famous example in PCB is how Yuyuko was cursed into suicide in the past, and at the end of the game she discovers her own body buried under the Sagyo Ayakashi tree. PCB also introduced the character of Yukari Yakumo, a mysterious yokai with the ability to manipulate boundaries, and possibly one of the most important characters in the series who's gonna become more and more relevant as it goes on, being one of the sages and creators of Gensokyo. A year after Perfect Cherry Blossom, two additional works were released. The first was Curiosities of Lotus Asia, which isn't really a full work, but rather small stories divided in chapters that were released in various magazines throughout the years. These follow the curio shop owner, Rinosuke Morichika, as he chats with the various customers that visit his shop, and gives his own, often inaccurate views of the world of Gensokyo. The unreliable narrator is something Touhou uses very often, as almost all things are written or said in universe by one or more of the characters, so it's up to the reader to pick up the pieces, understand how each character thinks, and come to their own conclusions of what's really true, at least as far as it's possible to do. Anyways, at this point, Sun decided to try his hand at a music CD once again, and so we got Ghostly Field Club, the second entry of Sun's music collection, and the first in the series commonly known as Hifu in the community. Like his previous album, these also have stories. They follow Meri and Renko, two college students living in a version of real-world Japan in the near future, as they each give their own perspective on the state of affairs and occasionally slip into Gensokyo, encountering the various creatures that lurk in it. Hifu is not as dark as Dolls in Pseudo Paradise, I'd say, but again, same theme of showing this other side to Gensokyo, the one a human would see if they happen to find themselves lost in it. We'll talk a bit more about Hifu later, since these stories are undeniably deeply connected to the rest of the Touhou works, but for now, let's continue on with the games Imperishable Night and Phantasmagoria of Flower View. The reason I'm pairing these two together is because they both start adding more aspects of Japanese folklore into the mix, something Sun spans on even more in later works, with characters based on different folktales and legends, as well as using already established yokai instead of making up his own. Examples such as the previously mentioned Kaguya from the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, Moon Rabbits, the Yama in charge of judging the dead, among others. Both games also have a lot of interactions between characters due to the sheer number of them, especially Phantasmagoria of Flower View, which furthers Sun's goal of creating an interconnected world that feels alive. There is talk that at some point Sun apparently meant to end the series at Imperishable Night. He said that the game wouldn't have been possible without the build-up of the previous two. But I think it's also simply because Imperishable Night is crammed with so much content, like having different bosses for the last stage, a spellcard practice, and the last words, particularly powerful spellcards that need to be unlocked and act as one final challenge to test your skills. What exactly led him to continue the series? I'd guess it was partially the unexpected success of it and his newfound desire to do more with the setting. In fact, around the release of POFB, we got the book Bohemian Archive in Japanese Red, a series of articles and interviews with various characters that, once again, aim to further world building. A year after, Perfect Memento in Strict Sense released, which is more akin to an encyclopedia, giving us some details on pretty much every character we know up to this point, as well as overviews on species and different locations. Though once again, this is written in-universe by the character of Hieda no Akyu, so everything is to be taken with a grain of salt. I gotta say, mind you, this is a fantastic way to make the world seem more real. You're not just reading Sun's own words telling you about his characters, you're reading articles written from the point of view of a person that lives in Gensokyo, with their own biases and interpretations, and again it's up to you to draw your own conclusions. This is where I previously ended the classic era of Touhou, and I still agree with that designation. It's when Sun shifted gears and decided to start building an actual world for his works to take place in. And I personally like this period a lot. Partially because of nostalgia, I'm not gonna lie, but also because it has this air of mystery and mysticism to it, like you're exploring an unknown world that's as beautiful as it is dangerous. That's the idea of Touhou that I get from this era. It's I think one of the reasons the series became such a common pick for fanworks, and while it's an idea that's maintained over time, it kinda starts to lose steam as more and more things are shown and explained. The fear of the unknown is said to be one of our biggest fears, the uncertainty of not knowing what lies beyond or what it can do to us, but it also may awaken our curiosity as we aim to discover more about it. That's why this era is so appealing to me, and it's what made me want to learn more about the world of Touhou, even if it meant having to abandon that feeling in the process. Battle of Faith is the 10th Touhou game, and it marked a big jump for the series, both in gameplay and lore. This is the start of the modern era of Touhou, and although I previously ended it at the 12th game Undefined Fantastic Object for the sake of convenience, I'd say it actually continues on to this day. Instead of simply delineating a world and leaving us to explore it, now some rules start being explained, as the focus shifts to learning about the inner workings of Gensokyo, how its society functions, what sort of issues it faces, and what's the relation between the different factions that habitate in it. Some might say this is where Touhou became political, the best example of that being the book Symposium of Post-Mysticism, featuring a lengthy dialogue between three important religious leaders, as they each give their opinion on topics such as the state of Gensokyo and the outside world, yokai, and of course religion. We also see it in the games too, like double leading character bringing yokai hierarchy into question, or Wily Beast and Weakest Creature, which could be a whole video in and of itself. Sun also started using Touhou as a medium for his own commentary as well, which most often blends in pretty well within the world of Gensokyo. The whole deal about nuclear energy that started with subterranean animism, later explored further in other works, Goyuku Ibun or Sunken Fossil World, which is a big screaming oil is bad message, alternative facts in Inter-Utopia, like most of it. And although they could be observed in past works as well, we can see the main themes of Touhou more prominently starting with Mountain of Faith, with Gensokyo being a place where all that is forgotten in our world comes to pass, something often described as passing into fantasy. In here, the existence of most things rely heavily on belief or faith, and there is plenty of it to go around. In fact, that is the reason the Moria Shrine settled in Gensokyo, since in the outside world faith in gods was dwindling, and without faith they would cease to exist. In a similar way, yokai need belief to exist. They need to be feared. They are essentially manifestations of human fears, and without that they are nothing, literally. That said, this is more like a collective consciousness kind of thing. You can't just, I don't know, go up to Rumi and say, I don't think you're real, and she'll just poof out of existence. No, you're gonna get chomped. And this is something that has some interesting implications regarding the human village, which are explored in the manga Forbidden Scrollery. It suggests that there is a symbiotic relationship between humans and yokai. Yokai need humans that believe in them in order to exist, so the human village was put in place for them to gain belief from. Meanwhile, the human village is protected by yokai so that no harm comes to it, being that it's essentially their lifeline. That's why there's also strict rules for yokai to not attack the humans inside the village, since that would obviously disrupt the delicate balance of things. For that reason, yokai mainly attack humans from the outside world unlucky enough to find themselves in Gensokyo. In this manga, Yukari describes Reimu not as a yokai exterminator, but as a balancer, someone tasked with making sure both humans and yokai stay on their lane and do their jobs. The fortune teller is a famous case of someone breaking the rules. He's the only yokai we've ever seen Reimu actually exterminate, not only for committing the sin of turning from human to yokai, but also for stating that he's not actually interested in playing his role as one. It's a very well-crafted subversion that's actually hinted at much earlier in the series, as far back as Perfect Memento Strict Sense, I'm pretty sure, but this is where explicitly talked about. Going into Touhou at first, you may think Reimu's job is to keep Gensokyo's humans safe from yokai, and part of it is, sure, that was probably even the end of that at one point, but now there's a much different motive. To keep Gensokyo working as it should so it can be a safe haven for yokai is Reimu's real job description, even if it involves killing a former human now and then. I mean, she was ready to put her Gouki through Kosusu at a moment's notice, like what the fuck? Now you might be wondering, if yokai subsist on the fear of humans alone, why do you need to attack them? Well, one way to look at it is as the complete realization of the fear they represent. Why would anyone be scared of yokai if they weren't able to bring any harm to them? Fearing the unknown can only go so far. At some point you'll be made aware of its true form, and if that form is completely harmless, then there's no reason to fear it. and so the need for an actual threat arises, a way to confirm and maintain that fear. After all, it's hard to deny the existence of yokai if one is currently eating you. It's also just in their nature, like that's how yokai do. It's said that some are happy to just scare people and be done with it, but it's safe to assume that for the most part, they do prey on humans. Maybe it's also some sort of delicacy for them. I mean, we also don't subsist on one kind of food alone. Why would yokai be any different? Why wouldn't they need or want to consume both fear and the actual flesh itself? All that said, what's interesting is that we never see any actual attacks in any of the Touhou works, and I think that's because, at the end of the day, it's not really all that important. In Gensokyo, it's such a mundane fact of life that there's not really any need to show it, we just need to know that it happens. There's also the fact that we never see any story from the perspective of regular humans. It's always the ones who are used to seeing yokai and can actually fight back against them. The closest one is Kosusu Motori, and that's the entire plot of Forbidden Scrollery, which I'm not gonna retell here. Well, that and Hifu. Like I mentioned earlier, Hifu involves two relatively normal college girls from our world. I say it like that because they do have their quirks to them. Renko is basically a living GPS, able to tell the location and time just by looking at the stars, while Meri has the ability to see boundaries. Wait, where have I heard that before? Whenever they have an encounter with Gensokyo, we get to see it from their perspectives. Particularly Meri, since she's the one who actually slips through the boundaries most often. What caught my attention here is how human Meri's journey is as she experiences these events, and how similar it was to my own journey as I learned about Touhou. Things get even more interesting when you consider all the implications with Meri and Yukari and all that, and that's something I'm not gonna go into right now. Anyways, through her eyes, Gensokyo is always painted as this strange, dangerous place. Dreamlike in essence, which is what these excursions are often described as, dreams. At first, she fears this strange land since she often finds herself in danger whenever she arrives there, the feeling of dread and apprehension that the unknown brings. However, with time, and as her abilities evolve, that feeling turns into curiosity and finally, excitement. She wants to know and learn more about those places, understand them, and perhaps one day make those dreams a reality. And who's to say she hasn't already done so? As I said, the state of modern Touhou revolves around dealing with the issues that affect Gensokyo and its society, which occasionally reminds us of things that we see in our world. It presents us with an expansive world rich in lore, with many elements to explore and think about, as we aim to get a better understanding of Gensokyo. Classic Touhou, on the other hand, offers a unique atmosphere in its simplicity, one that aims to fill you with images of a fantastic and beautiful land, along with the uneasiness and curiosity for what lacks a proper explanation. And I love both of them to death, because at the end of the day, this distinction doesn't really matter. Touhou is all of these things and more, a seemingly perfect paradise with a captivating history, along with just enough unsettling undertones to keep you on edge, and some things left unexplained to let your imagination run wild. And every time I come back to it, I learn something new. I notice elements I previously missed and come to different conclusions. I seek other points of view that make me look at things from a different angle, and come to realizations that would have been impossible on my own. Because of this, I don't think I can ever make one definitive video with all my thoughts on the works. It feels impossible to, at one point, finally reach a complete understanding. But that to me is what's so appealing about it, that feeling of discovering something new every time. That's the beauty of Touhou, past and present, and future. Anyways, that's my piece for now. As always, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might imagine. Thanks for listening to the ramblings of someone who's been into the series for far too long. I'll see you next stream.